The streets of Chicago were unnaturally quiet that night, an oppressive silence draping itself over the city like a shroud. The usual cacophony of honking cars, distant sirens, and murmuring crowds had been swallowed whole by the creeping fog that coiled around the buildings. The mist clung to every surface, its cold, damp fingers chilling anyone who dared venture into its depths. Clara ran, her boots slamming against the wet pavement, the sound echoing down the deserted alleyways. Each breath tore at her lungs, burning and shallow. Her Glock 19 felt heavy in her trembling hands, its weight both a comfort and a grim reminder of her dwindling chances. The growl behind her was the kind that made the hair on the back of her neck rise, low, guttural, and undeniably inhuman. It reverberated through the narrow alley, a sound that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Clara didn't dare look back. She'd seen enough already. Hours earlier, her night had begun with the familiar thrill of chasing a lead. The Lakeview Butcher, a name whispered with equal parts fear and fascination, had left behind a trail of mutilated corpses across the city. Each victim was a grotesque display of surgical precision, a signature that both intrigued and horrified Clara. Her relentless pursuit of the truth had led her to a decrepit warehouse on the city's south side, a building that seemed to exhale malevolence with every creak of its ancient timbers. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick and cloying, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and decay. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing grotesque splatters on the walls and floor. The stench was overpowering, a vile mixture of rot and something acrid that made her stomach churn. At the center of the room, illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight, stood the man she'd been hunting. The Lakeview Butcher, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, was hunched over a table, sharpening a machete with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His lips curled into a manic smile when he noticed her, but what truly froze her in place was the shadow behind him. It wasn't just a trick of the light or her imagination. The shadow moved independently, writhing and shifting like smoke trapped in a glass jar. It was a presence, palpable and wrong, its glowing green eyes piercing through the gloom. As Clara stepped back, her foot scuffed against a loose plank, the sound breaking the tense silence. The butcher turned, his gaze locking onto hers, and all hell broke loose. Now with the butcher and that thing, whatever it was, chasing her through the labyrinthine streets, Clara's mind raced. The alley spilled into a broader street, littered with abandoned cars and debris. The remnants of a recent explosion, she had no idea what caused it, left the road cracked and steaming. Clara dove behind a rusted sedan, pressing her back against the cold metal as she fought to steady her breathing. Her phone was useless, its screen cracked and lifeless. She checked her magazine. 7 rounds. Not enough. Never enough. The butcher emerged moments later, his machete glinting under the sickly glow of a flickering street lamp. His face was serene, almost blissful, as if he reveled in the hunt. The shadow creature slithered behind him, its form now towering over him, its claws carving deep grooves into the pavement as it moved. It let out a shriek, a high-pitched, grating sound that rattled Clara's very bones. "Come out, little rabbit," the butcher cooed, his voice dripping with mockery. He dragged the machete along the side of a car, the screech of metal on metal setting Clara's teeth on edge. "You can't hide forever." Clara's grip tightened on the Glock. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She peeked through the shattered window of the sedan, watching as the butcher's eyes scanned the darkness with predatory precision. The shadow's glowing eyes locked onto her hiding spot, and she knew the game was up. She stood abruptly, leveling the Glock at the butcher's chest. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice cracked under the weight of her fear. "Or what?" he taunted, spreading his arms wide in a mock invitation. "You'll shoot me? Go ahead. See what happens when you're alone with it." Clara didn't wait for him to make the first move. She fired, the gun's report deafening in the stillness. The bullet struck the butcher in the shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted, more annoyed than hurt, and staggered backward. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as if the shot had affected it too. But the reprieve was brief. The creature let out another piercing shriek and surged forward. Clara turned and ran, her boots slipping on the slick pavement. She barreled into a convenience store, the bell above the door jingling weakly as she crashed inside. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the already tense atmosphere unbearable. She shoved a shelf of canned goods in front of the door, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped her gun. The aisles were a chaotic mess, broken bottles, spilled cereal, and dark smears that she didn't want to think about. Somewhere in the back of the store, she heard movement. Clara approached cautiously, her gun raised. She found a young man huddled behind the counter, clutching a shotgun. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, pointing the shotgun at her. "Clara," she said quickly, keeping her voice low. "I'm not one of them." "Them?" he repeated, his voice cracking. Before she could answer, the front door exploded inward, cans and debris scattering across the floor. The butcher stepped through the wreckage, his machete raised. The shadow followed, its form oozing through the doorway like liquid darkness. Clara didn't hesitate. "Get down!" she shouted, diving behind the counter as the young man fired the shotgun. The blast hit the butcher square in the chest, sending him crashing into a display of chips. But the shadow was faster. It surged forward, enveloping the young man in a suffocating wave. His screams were cut short as his body convulsed violently, then fell limp to the floor. Clara grabbed the shotgun from his lifeless hands and pumped the remaining shells into the shadow. The blast seemed to slow it down, its form flickering like a dying flame, but it wasn't enough. She turned and ran again, bursting through the back door into an alley choked with smoke and ash. Her mind raced, desperation clawing at her sanity. She needed a plan, a weapon, anything to turn the tide. Her eyes landed on a propane tank near a dumpster. It was reckless, suicidal even, but it was all she had. She dragged the tank into the center of the alley and fumbled for her lighter, her hands slick with sweat. The butcher's laughter echoed behind her, closer now. "You can't run forever," he taunted, his voice carrying an edge of glee. The lighter finally sparked to life, the tiny flame sputtering in the cold air. Clara held it against the tank's valve, praying it would work. The butcher rounded the corner, his machete gleaming. The shadow loomed behind him, its glowing eyes narrowing as it realized what she was doing. "Hey, psycho," Clara shouted, her voice hoarse. "Catch." She kicked the tank toward them and fired the shotgun. The explosion was instant, a deafening roar that shook the very ground. The blast sent Clara flying into a pile of garbage, her ears ringing and her vision blurred. When she managed to push herself up, she saw the butcher's body crumpled against the wall, unmoving. The shadow creature writhed in the flames, its form disintegrating like ash caught in a hurricane. But it wasn't gone. Not entirely. As Clara staggered to her feet, the faint outline of the shadow began to reassemble, weaker, but still dangerous. She grabbed the butcher's machete, its blade somehow unscathed, and turned to face the creature. It lunged at her, its claws slicing through the air. Clara swung with everything she had, the blade cutting through the darkness like a knife through thick fog. The creature screamed, its ethereal form splitting apart, pieces of shadow scattering like ink dissolving in water. Clara didn't stop. She swung again and again, her arms aching as she hacked at the beast. Each strike felt like cutting through thick smoke, but with every blow, the shadow grew fainter, its glowing green eyes dimming. The alley fell into a tense silence, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing. She staggered backward, the machete slipping from her bloodied hands. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the wall, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The shadow was gone, or so it seemed. But then, a faint whisper filled the air, chilling and otherworldly. The remnants of the creature began to stir, a swirling mist coalescing into a faint shape. Clara's eyes widened as she realized the battle wasn't over. "No," she muttered, dragging herself to her feet. Her body screamed in protest, but she clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand. From the ruins of the convenience store, a low groan echoed. Clara turned to see the butcher, impossibly alive, dragging himself to his feet. His face was burned and bloodied, his body twisted and broken, but his eyes burned with a manic fury. "You can't kill us," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "We're eternal." Clara's heart sank. She was out of ammunition, out of strength, and out of time. The shadow was reforming, the butcher was advancing, and she had nowhere to run. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Her eyes darted to a fire escape ladder hanging above her. It was a slim chance, but it was all she had. With a burst of desperate energy, Clara leaped for the ladder, her fingers just barely catching the bottom rung. She hauled herself upward, the metal cold and slick beneath her hands. Below, the butcher let out a roar of rage, his machete slicing through the air as he lunged for her. The blade missed by inches, the sound of its swish sending a jolt of terror through her. The shadow creature surged upward, its form stretching unnaturally as it reached for her. Clara scrambled higher, her boots slipping on the rungs. She reached the rooftop just as the shadow's claws grazed her ankle, leaving a burning sensation that made her cry out. She collapsed onto the gravel-strewn roof, clutching her leg. The butcher was climbing now, his movements slow but relentless. The shadow slithered up the wall beside him, its form growing stronger with each passing second. Clara crawled backward, her hands searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a piece of rebar, and she gripped it tightly. The butcher pulled himself onto the roof, his mangled body casting a horrifying silhouette against the city lights. "Nowhere left to run," he sneered, advancing toward her. The shadow loomed behind him, its glowing eyes fixed on Clara. Clara forced herself to her feet, the rebar held like a spear in her trembling hands. "You want me?" she shouted, her voice hoarse but defiant. "Come and get me." The butcher charged, his machete raised high. Clara waited until the last possible moment, then sidestepped, swinging the rebar with all her strength. It connected with his head, the impact reverberating through her arms. The butcher staggered, his grip on the machete loosening. Clara didn't hesitate. She drove the rebar into his chest, pushing with every ounce of strength she had left. The butcher let out a guttural scream, his body convulsing as the rebar pierced through him. The shadow creature howled, its form flickering violently as if it shared his pain. Clara twisted the rebar, her teeth clenched, and with a final, desperate shove, she sent the butcher stumbling backward. He teetered on the edge of the roof for a moment, his arms flailing, before he fell. His body hit the pavement below with a sickening thud. The shadow let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. It writhed and twisted, its glowing eyes dimming until they disappeared entirely. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, the rebar still clutched in her hands. The rooftop was silent, the city below eerily still. Clara sank to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her body ached, her hands were raw and bloodied, and her mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. But she was alive. Somehow, against all odds, she had survived. As she sat there, the first rays of dawn began to break through the fog, painting the city in a pale, golden light. The nightmare was over, for now. But deep down, Clara knew this wasn't the end. The shadow's whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, a chilling reminder that some battles never truly end.